My stepfather had me listed as a security threat at my grandmother's hospital. Those were the exact words the nurse used when she stopped me at the ward entrance. Potential security threat, like I was a stranger off the street and not the woman who had driven 5 hours through the dark to get there. He had told the admitting staff I had a history of emotional episodes. He said he was concerned I might distress the patient. My grandmother was 79 years old with a fractured hip and mild hypothermia from being found on the lawn of her cottage in 6-degree September weather in the Gatineau Hills. 3 hours after I arrived and sat in that waiting area with a cold paper cup of coffee from the vending machine, my stepfather walked through the main doors in his good blazer, a Tim Hortons in hand, looking like a man who had stopped off to run an errand on the way to something more important. When he came around the corner and saw me standing at the nurse's station, the cup tilted in his grip. He took a half step back. He said my name like it was an accusation. He told me I was supposed to be in Toronto. He told me I had no business being there. Before I tell you what he had been doing to my grandmother for the past 2 years, and how a career I walked away from became the exact instrument of his complete undoing, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments below. If you have ever had to fight for someone you love against a person who is supposed to be family, hit the like button and subscribe. My name is Carys, I am 29 years old, and by the end of this, he had nothing left. I grew up in a small city in the Ottawa Valley, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone's business, and very few people actually say what they mean. My mother and my biological father separated when I was 11, and for 6 years after that it was just the two of us and my grandmother, who lived 20 minutes away on her property at Lac Sainte Marie, and came for Sunday dinners and knew how to fix a burst pipe, and had opinions about everything and was right about most of them. She was the person who taught me to pay attention, to ask the second question when the first answer felt too easy. She had a saying she'd repeated my whole childhood: money always tells the truth, even when people don't. I became a financial crimes analyst partly because of her. My stepfather came into our lives when I was 17. He was charming in the way certain men are charming, smooth enough that you couldn't quite put your finger on what felt wrong, but something did, quietly, if you were paying attention. My mother loved him genuinely. I never doubted that, I just never trusted him. He had a way of talking about other people's things as though they were already his. When my grandmother's health started to slip, a diagnosis of early vascular dementia came the previous spring. He was the first one to suggest that someone needed to step in and help her manage her affairs. He offered himself. My mother thought it was generous. I had been away for years by then. I had done 5 years with the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit, mostly in Ontario, and when I left federal service I built my own forensic accounting consultancy in Toronto. The kind of work that involves sitting quietly with very large sets of documents until you find the thing someone spent considerable effort hoping no one would ever find. My family thought of it as accountant work. My stepfather specifically had referred to it once at Christmas as bookkeeping essentially. That was fine, I had no reason to correct him. The call came on a Saturday night in September. An unknown number, a woman's voice. A nurse at Pontiac Community Hospital in Shawville, about an hour west of Ottawa. My grandmother had been brought in by ambulance earlier that evening, found on the lawn of the cottage, disoriented and cold. She had been at the birthday gathering my stepfather had organized for her. A small family thing, he had told my mother, just close people low-key. I had not been invited. My stepfather had told my mother I had declined because of a work deadline. He had not asked me at all. The hospital had my name as a secondary contact in my grandmother's old records, a file she had filled out years earlier. My stepfather had updated himself to primary contact when he began accompanying her to appointments. He had missed me entirely in the process. That single oversight was going to cost him everything he had spent 2 years carefully constructing. I was in my car within 20 minutes. The 417 to Ottawa and then north through Pontiac County takes just under 5 hours if you do not stop. I did not stop. When I arrived at 2 in the morning and found that I had been flagged as a potential disturbance by the man responsible for leaving my grandmother outside in near-freezing temperatures, I did not argue with the nurse. She was apologetic and clearly uncomfortable. I told her I understood completely, and I sat down in the nearest chair, and I sent a message to a former colleague from my RCMP years, a man who now ran a financial crimes task force out of the Ottawa field office, and told him I thought I might have something worth looking at. I asked him to be available when I called. At just past 5 in the morning, my stepfather arrived. My mother was with him. She came through the main doors first, and when she registered me sitting in the waiting area, she pressed her hand to her chest and said my name in the voice she used when something had gone unexpectedly wrong. My stepfather came in behind her, assessed the situation in about 2 seconds, and walked toward me with his hands in his coat pockets and the particular expression he used when he considered himself the most informed person in a room and found it tiresome that no one else had caught up yet. He told me quietly and with measured patience that I should not have come. He said my grandmother needed calm right now and that my presence was going to make a difficult situation harder than it needed to be. He said she had wandered outside on her own and no one had realized she'd gone until it was too late. He said these things happened with her condition. He said it with genuine sounding regret and absolutely no remorse underneath it. I asked him how long she had been outside before anyone went looking. He said maybe 45 minutes. I asked why a 79-year-old woman with a documented dementia diagnosis had been unsupervised at an outdoor property in September after dark. He said she liked to sit outside. He said it was not his fault she had lost track of time. My mother put her hand on my arm and told me it was not the time. She was crying and she meant it entirely, and that was the hardest thing to sit with. That she believed the version of events she was being handed, because she always had, because she loved him and he had been careful. My stepfather held that look on his face for a moment longer. Then he took a step down the corridor, away from my mother, and lowered his voice until it was just above a whisper. He told me he wanted to be very clear about something before we went any further. He said my grandmother's cognitive decline was well documented, and that if I chose to make any kind of trouble, he had the capacity assessments and the medical records and the full cooperation of the estate planning professionals he had been working with for the past 2 years. He said his documentation was thorough and that he had worked with some of the best lawyers in the region. He told me I was a single woman running a small consultancy out of a condo, and that if I tried to make accusations I couldn't substantiate, I would find myself on the wrong end of a defamation action that would take years to resolve and cost everything I had built to fight. He said all of this very quietly, and he smiled as he said it, that particular smile, just slightly too certain, just slightly too settled, the smile of a man who had already decided how the situation was going to end. I looked at him. I told him I would think carefully about it. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and withdrew a white envelope. He held it out with the particular manner he had when he wanted to appear generous, while maintaining total control. Unhurried, deliberate, the expression on his face communicating that he was doing me a kindness and expected it to be recognized. He told me it was from him and my mother, to cover the drive up and any time I had taken off work, and that the family appreciated me making the effort. Inside the envelope was a certified check for 12,000 Canadian dollars. The account printed on the check was not a personal account. It was a numbered company, 7 digits followed by the word holdings. I had looked at hundreds of these documents in my RCMP years. Numbered corporations registered provincially, used for everything from legitimate tax planning to carefully structured concealment of assets. I held the check by its very edges. I read the routing information along the bottom the way I read most things. Quietly, once, completely. I memorized the account and routing numbers before I had finished looking at the line. I folded the check and put it in my coat pocket. I thanked him. I said I needed some air. I stood outside the hospital's main entrance in the September dark and I called my former colleague. I told him I had a numbered Ontario corporation and a routing number, and I believed I was looking at financial exploitation of a vulnerable person, potentially including a fraudulent power of attorney and unauthorized registered retirement savings transfers. I gave him everything I had. He told me to give him a few hours. I went back inside and I sat with my mother through the rest of the night. I held her hand while she described the birthday dinner, the food, the cake, the moment someone at the table noticed an empty chair. I listened to every word. I said nothing about the check. I said nothing about the call I had just made. At 9 in the morning, a nurse came out to find me and said my grandmother was awake and asking for me specifically. She was small in the hospital bed, her hair loose around her face, which was wrong. She had always kept it in a braid. Her left wrist was bandaged where she had caught herself when she fell. But when I came through the doorway, she reached out with her right hand and I took it and sat next to her, and she looked at me and said, very quietly and very precisely, "I have been hoping you would come." I asked her how she was feeling. She said she was frightened. She said she needed to tell me something she had not been able to say to anyone else, and she needed me to check that the door was closed first. I checked, it was. She told me that over the past several months, my stepfather had visited her at the cottage many times without my mother. He always brought papers. He explained them as routine, small updates to her will, adjustments to ensure things went smoothly later on. Exactly the kind of housekeeping that a responsible family should have sorted out while she was still able to manage it. He had been patient and very gentle about it, and whenever she'd asked questions, he'd simplified things until she felt as though she was being fussy, as though the questions themselves were the inconvenience. She had signed things, she did not know exactly what. 2 weeks before the birthday gathering, she had called her bank in Wakefield to check on her RSP, the same account she had held for 30 years, built up carefully from decades of work and modest savings. The automated system told her the account was no longer available for self-service inquiries and that all questions should be directed to the account's designated power of attorney. She had not granted power of attorney to anyone, not knowingly, not willingly. She looked at me from the bed and told me she had not said anything because she did not want to cause trouble for my mother. She did not want my mother to have to choose between the two of them. I told her no one was going to make her choose. I told her I was going to take care of it. I meant it as straightforwardly as I have ever meant anything. My former colleague called back at noon. He used the word extraordinary twice in the first 3 minutes of speaking, which told me everything I needed to know about the scale of what he had found. My stepfather had incorporated the numbered company quietly, approximately 3 years prior, shortly after my grandmother's dementia diagnosis had been formally recorded. He had then arranged to have her sign a continuing power of attorney for property, a document that under Ontario law authorizes another person to make all financial decisions on an individual's behalf. The document on file at her bank had been notarized by an office outside Ottawa, with no record of my grandmother ever appearing there in person. A comparison between the signature on the power of attorney and verified samples of my grandmother's actual handwriting, conducted by a forensic document examiner I contacted that same afternoon, showed measurable and specific inconsistency consistent with forgery. Using the fraudulent power of attorney, my stepfather had moved $246,000 from my grandmother's RRSP accounts into the numbered company over the course of 18 months. He had registered a private mortgage against the cottage through a lender who asked few questions of a valid power of attorney. He had listed the property for sale with a real estate office in Ottawa under the numbered company's name, with an anticipated closing date approximately 6 weeks from that day. My grandmother did not know her home of 40 years was for sale. The $12,000 certified check he had handed me in the hospital corridor had come directly from those transferred funds. He had not been compensating me for a long drive. He had offered me my grandmother's own retirement savings in exchange for my silence, and he had called it a gesture of goodwill. I compiled everything my colleague had gathered and forwarded it to the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit formal intake line. I sent a parallel notification to my grandmother's bank, which triggered their mandatory review obligations under the Proceeds of Crime and Terrorist Financing Act. Then I called the family's longtime estate lawyer in Gatineau and told her I had credible evidence of a fraudulent power of attorney on file for my grandmother and that I needed an urgent review meeting with all relevant parties present. The lawyer scheduled the meeting for the following Thursday and reached out to confirm attendance. My stepfather confirmed the same day. His business associate, a man who had been involved in several of the property dealings, also confirmed, apparently believing this was a routine estate planning session he had been invited to observe as a courtesy. I said nothing to my mother until the day before the meeting. I sat with her at her kitchen table in the house they had shared, the house that was now, technically, collateral against a debt she had not known existed, and I walked her through the documents one at a time. I did not editorialize. I did not ask her to respond to any of it while I was still talking. I showed her the corporate registry, the forged signature and the comparison report, the RRSP transfer records, the private mortgage registration, the real estate listing. I let her go through each one at her own pace. When she finished, she sat very still for a long time. Then she asked me, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere deep and far away, whether her mother had known any of it. I told her no, her mother had been frightened to ask questions. My mother did not speak to him that night. She slept in the guest room and drove herself to the meeting the following morning. The boardroom in Gatineau was on the fourth floor of a building on Promenade du Portage that overlooked the Ottawa River on a clear autumn morning. My grandmother attended in a wheelchair with a care aide beside her. My mother sat to her left. My stepfather arrived in his very best suit and took a seat across the table with the settled, unhurried ease of a man who had done this kind of paperwork before and expected to leave in under an hour. His business associate took a chair near the window. The lawyer opened the meeting. She said she had some questions about the execution of the power of attorney document she had recently reviewed, and she looked at my stepfather as she said this. He smiled pleasantly and said he was happy to provide whatever clarity she needed. I opened the file I had brought. I placed the Ontario Business Registry printout on the table showing my stepfather as the sole director and signing authority of the numbered company. I placed beside it the power of attorney bearing my grandmother's signature and the forensic document examiner's written comparison report, with the relevant inconsistencies highlighted. My grandmother leaned forward in her wheelchair to look at the document. She turned it so she could read the signature clearly. Then she said, in a voice that carried to every corner of that room, "That is not my signature. I did not write that." My stepfather said the comparison report was fabricated. He said I had manufactured the evidence. He said this was exactly the kind of destructive behavior my mother had defended him against for years, and he looked at my mother as he said it, willing her to confirm it, expecting the look she had always given him when she chose to trust his version of things over mine. My mother looked back at him and said nothing. I placed the RRSP transfer records on the table, 2 years of transactions, every date, every amount, every authorization code traceable back to the fraudulent power of attorney document. I placed the private mortgage registration. I placed the real estate listing, printed 2 days prior, with the anticipated closing date underlined. I looked across the table at him and told him I was giving him the opportunity, in front of the family lawyer and his own associate, to explain how $246,000 of my grandmother's retirement savings had been moved into a corporation she had never heard of, secured by a signature she had never written, to finance the sale of a property she still considered her home. The room was entirely silent. His business associate stood up, said he needed to step outside to make a call, and did not come back. My stepfather tried twice more. He said the transfers had been properly authorized under the power of attorney as it stood. He said there was a documentation discrepancy that his lawyers would address. He said I had a personal grudge that went back years and that the family was the victim here, not me, and he said all of this with steadily decreasing conviction, like a man walking toward a door he had only just realized was not going to open. Then the boardroom door did open. 2 members of the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit entered with the lawyer's consent, carrying a warrant for arrest on charges of fraud over $5,000, criminal breach of trust, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under the Criminal Code of Canada. He stood up fast. His chair scraped back hard and caught the window ledge behind him. He looked across the table at me, not at my grandmother, not at my mother. Only at me. He said I had destroyed his life. I told him he had handed me everything I needed. They walked him out of the room. The door closed behind them. My grandmother reached across the corner of the table and placed her hand on top of mine. The legal proceedings that followed were thorough. The fraudulent power of attorney was voided by court order. The RRSP transfers were traced in full, and a restitution order was attached to the conviction, directing every recoverable asset toward what was owed. The private mortgage against the cottage was successfully challenged through civil proceedings and nullified. It had been obtained through a forged authorization and did not stand. The real estate listing was withdrawn. The cottage remained in my grandmother's name, unencumbered, exactly as it had been for 40 years. His business associate cooperated with the RCMP investigation. That cooperation made the fraud case considerably more complete than it might otherwise have been. My stepfather was convicted on 3 counts and sentenced to 4 years in a federal correctional facility. A restitution order and criminal record would follow him for the remainder of his life. He lost the house. He lost his standing in the Ottawa Valley real estate community, which he had spent more than a decade building into something that looked, from the outside, like respectability. Everything he had constructed using my grandmother's money was methodically dismantled and accounted for. My mother filed for divorce in February. It was a quiet process and a hard one, and I did not try to rush her through any part of it. I answered the phone when she called. I drove up when she needed me there. We worked through it the way families sometimes do when a long-held story finally falls apart. Slowly, imperfectly, with many silences and small repairs made across kitchen tables over coffee that went cold before anyone touched it. By the following summer, we were both at the cottage. My grandmother's hip healed completely. Her dementia does not reverse. We understand that and we have made our peace with what it means day to day, but her affairs are now properly and legally documented, with a genuine power of attorney in place and her finances monitored carefully by people who love her. We spent that August at Lac Sainte Marie, the three of us, swimming in the mornings and sitting on the dock in the evenings while the light went long and golden over the water. My grandmother told me a story I had already heard 3 times, and I listened all the way to the end of it without interrupting, and I was glad to be sitting exactly where I was and nowhere else. I kept the certified check. I never cashed it. It sits in a file folder in my office now, behind a small piece of glass, as a reminder of the single most expensive mistake he ever made. He had handed a forensic accountant the routing number to his own fraud, called it a kind gesture, and walked away certain he had handled the problem. He handed me the weapon and called it a gift. If someone in your life is managing the finances or the paperwork of a person you love, an elderly parent, a grandparent, anyone whose affairs are in someone else's hands, ask questions. Ask the second question when the first answer comes too easily. Money always tells the truth. My grandmother taught me that before I was old enough to understand what it meant. It was, in the end, the thing that saved her. Thank you for listening. If this story reached you in a way that mattered, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe, and I will be back with another one. Take care of the people who took care of you before someone else decides to take advantage of them first.